Hi everyone, welcome back. So this will be the last chapter of section 1. We're going to cover gender differences, male and female social constructs. So biological differences, of course, in males and females determine one's sex, and traditionally men and women were studied under these differences. So it's been assumed that differences in biological anatomy mean there's differences in between how men and women act and feel. But now psychologists recognize that what is male and what is female are based on social constructs. So now we're using the term gender differences. So personality psychologists are now interested in whether these physical differences between males and females do cause psychological gender differences, and whether differing physically and physiologically leads to a simple biological justification for personality differences between men and women. So statistically shown, there are obvious physical and physiological differences between men and women in average height, external genitalia, facial hair, and hair growth, and then hormonal differences. So men and women have different levels of hormones that are responsible for a variety of biological features. Statistically, men tend to be stronger than women. However, baby girls and women appear to be constitutionally stronger than boys and men. Male children are also more susceptible to a variety of diseases and disabilities than females, and girls are more neurologically mature than boys at birth and through puberty. It's also been shown that women tend to live longer than men. However, nobody knows why this is or what the cause is. So overall, life expectancies in the United States and Canada have increased for both men and women. But even despite this, women's life expectancies have remained to be greater and continue to be greater than men's. But the reasons for this are still unknown. So because biological differences have shaped our complex social world, they have influenced our perception of male characteristics and female characteristics, and recognizable differences in personality. So males are often described as independent, aggressive, dominating, and objective, and females have often been described as emotional, nurturing, submissive, communicative, and sociable. In addition to biological differences, there have also found to be differences in masculinity versus femininity, which seem highly relevant. So masculinity are qualities generally associated with being a man, so aggressive, dominating, and femininity are qualities generally associated with being a woman, such as being nurturant and loving and submissive. In addition to biological differences, there's evidence for gender differences in psychological traits such as cognitive abilities in childhood and adulthood, aggression, and communication. So, for example, boys and men have shown to have better spatial abilities, whereas girls and women are more verbally advanced. Boys and men are more verbally and physically aggressive than females. Females are better at nonverbal communication and more sensitive to nonverbal cues than men. There's also gender differences in personality and behavior, such as dependency, suggestibility, and nurturance. However, as we do more research, these qualities are more difficult to confirm because now there is considerable overlap with many men being nurturant and many women being independent. And this is more so as our society places emphasis on gender equality and done away with gender norms. There was a study that evaluated masculinity and femininity and found that gender influenced the type of preferences and interests people had for occupations. So chemists were male type occupations that were preferred by men in the study, and then interior decorator, florists, and librarians were female type occupations that were preferred by the study's women. However, they found something really interesting after following these subjects over time, and they found that some masculine qualities were in some females and feminine qualities were in some males. And in addition to that, although women on average outlived men, both masculine men and masculine women were more likely to die younger than feminine women and men. So the conclusions of this study are that biology isn't the only underlying cause of differences. Socialization, learned behavior, thoughts and feelings, and social norms are all likely playing a role in these outcomes. So the yin and the yang were dichotomized representations of male and female components. And this is from the earliest Asian religious beliefs. So they dichotomized them into the yin and the yang. The yin represents the female, which is passive, whereas the yang portrays the male element as active, light, and hot. So leaders and priests were more likely to be male. And then as time went on, ideas about differences between men and women were formalized into the identification of women, not only as different but lesser. For example, Plato described women as weaker and inferior. Aristotle depicted women as incomplete and incompetent because of their inability to produce semen. So, together with the conception of women as being deficient, men was the view of women as having frail personalities. So, meaning being more emotional, unprincipled, suggestible, and indecisive. So, in the 19th century, Darwin talked about behavior and thought evolving as a result of functionality for survival. So, for example, maternal instinct, which is defined as an inborn emotional tendency towards nurturance. So, according to functionalists, most of a woman's energy was to be expended on pregnancy, childbirth, and lactation. And so, as a result, women had no remaining resources for developing other abilities. And these theorists also explain that the maternal instinct revealed itself in other domains. So, where women nurtured others, such as in their relationships, family, and close friends. So, these concepts have been used to explain and justify the dominant masculine position of men and the submissive feminine position of women in contemporary society. So, because there's hormonal differences between males and females, researchers have studied the effects of prenatal sex hormones on gender, behavior, and personality. And they have found that there is evidence that prenatal hormones do affect gender behavior through experimental data from animal studies and studies of humans that have experienced prenatal genetic or hormonal anomalies. So there is androgen, which is a hormone that affects the physical development of a fetus. And prenatal androgen exposure can also affect personality in some gender specific manner. So when researchers exposed developing animal fetuses to androgens during an early prenatal development, they found that greater amounts of androgens affected later behavior. And so these animals had higher levels of aggressive behavior and higher activity and energy levels. And so they also found that females that were androgenized showed more tomboy behavior and are more active than other girls. But it's unclear whether these so-called masculine personality traits result from exposure to androgen or are induced by parental expectations for the behavior of daughters that are exposed to male hormones. And were born with ambiguous external genitalia or other male typical appearances. Now, Turner syndrome is when a child is born with a single X chromosome. So they have XO, they don't have the Y chromosome. And these individuals, although they have female external genitals, they don't have like any ovaries, and they're not exposed to androgen, but they remain female and they are sterile. And there is some evidence that these girls engage in timid and feminine behavior, and they may display weaker mathematical and spatial skills. And these findings have been used to argue that at least certain aspects of feminine behavior have a direct genetic basis. basis. Many athletics groups in recent years developed rules that limit the levels of testosterone in athletes competing as females. When female athletes are found to produce very high levels of testosterone, they are banned from competition unless they reduce their testosterone levels through surgery or hormone suppressing drugs. And this is called hyperandrogenism, meaning there's excessive amounts of androgen levels. These women may be genetically and anatomically female, but their natural levels of testosterone are higher than the average woman. Puberty and menstruation bring a process of hormonal release in women, and that has been related to changes in women's feelings and behavior at various times of the month. So at the start of the cycle, the pituitary gland instructs ovaries to release large amounts of estrogen, which causes growth in the lining of the uterus. Halfway through the cycle, the pituitary releases a hormone that causes ovulation. The amount of estrogen then drops, increases on the 20th day, and then decreases again to the end of the cycle. And these oscillations in women's hormones are said to be related to female personality traits, including mood swings, violence, inability to make decisions, mental illness, and decreases in coordination. So whether these gender differences change or not really depends on our perspective. So if we tend to see gender differences as being caused primarily by physiological traits and biologically determined, then we will tend to consider them permanent, unchangeable, and even morally correct. But if these differences are seen as behavioral differences through reinforcement or psychological or socially constructed, then they can probably be more readily changed. And so it really depends on understanding the perspectives of how personality differences develop and the ways in which how we think about personality affect what it means to be a person and whether or not that can be changed. So the psychoanalytic approach is what Freud came up with, and this assumes that gender differences are caused biologically. And so they're due to emotional responses in our physical structure of our body, and we tend to relate and identify with the same-sex parent. So aggression, jealousy, rationality, dependency are due to the physical structural differences between men and women. And so when we identify with the same-sex parent and we desire the opposite sex, we start to take on qualities of that same-sex parent in order to live the experience of being able to possess that opposite sex. So for example, males have castration anxiety. They try to be like their fathers. They take on the special importance of their penis for pleasure and threats from their parents about masturbating. And so then the fact that they note that girls do not have this valued appendage means that they must have been castrated already for some devastating misdeed. And so to deal with this anxiety, the boy does identify with his father and takes on his father's personality traits, and while additionally being able to possess the mother through the father's experience. So the neo-analytic approach was developed by Erikson and assumes that the core of personality differences is due to the individual's sense of self and ego. So it has some elements of the Freudian psychoanalytic theory of personality because it does place an emphasis on biological differences, and that these biological differences then play a role in how a person identifies and what they self-identify with. But it discounts and rejects the emphasis on sexuality. Sexuality was the core of Freud's beliefs. So neo-analytic theorists believe that personality development does occur in childhood, but it's more than that. It's not only biological instincts and drives, but It's also a mixture of social, environmental, and cultural influences on personality development. And so the real approach here is placing a lot of emphasis on self development and self identity. Identity of the self is really important in this theory. Erikson's views on male traits such as being active and exploring, and female characteristics such as being nurturing and gentle, is really coming from the fact that males and females are identifying with these traits. They're nurturing and gentle. It's because they are self-identifying with them. And this is due to formation of the ego and the self. So the evolutionary perspective to personality differences proposes that individual differences and personality traits have evolved in part to provide us with some form of adaptive advantage in the environment. So they serve us in some way in order for us to survive and reproduce. So for example, natural selection would argue that the reason that men engage in sexual activity and casual sex is because evolutionarily it's imperative for men to have as many sexual contacts as possible in order to perpetuate their genes for the reason of survival and reproduction. The behaviorist approach to personality argues that personality traits are learned. And so we learn through reinforcement. So our behavior is based on this consistent manner through reinforcement. And so behaviorists don't believe that personality is based on genetics or predispositions, but rather we learn from others, through others, and we are reinforced. And so this is what creates our individual differences, is that people behave based on prior learning experiences. Behavioral learning techniques involve reinforcement, so that's operant learning through reward and positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. And so we're more likely going to repeat the behavior that was rewarded, and we're less likely to repeat the behavior when it's been negatively reinforced or punished. Modeling, so learning through others, conditioning, generalization, and vicarious learning are all techniques. The behaviorist argument also assumes that gender is a salient characteristic. And so boys tend to imitate the traits and behaviors they see in men, and girls are more likely to learn to perform like the women they see. So the cognitive approach to personality argues that our personality differences develop from our values and our cognitive representations of how we should behave and what it means to be a person. So the gender schema theory was introduced by Sandra Bem in 1981. They asserted that children learn about male and female roles from the culture in which they live. So according to the theory, children adjust their behavior to align with gender norms of their culture from earliest stages of social development. Usefulness of gender schemas are that they operate as cognitive filters or lenses through which we process gender relevant information. They affect our perceptions of others and ourselves, and they assist us in making decisions about our resulting behavior. Sandra Bem designed the Bem sex role inventory to classify individuals as feminine, masculine, androgynous, and undifferentiated. So feminine would be high in the endorsement of feminine qualities. Masculine is endorsing masculine characteristics. Androgynous is high in both masculine and feminine traits, or undifferentiated, which is low in both categories. Trait theorists have utilized the measure of achievement motivation, which determines the drive to strive for success. And so personality theorists are interested in looking at sex differences in ambition and ability and the desire for success. And according to a study, McClelland and colleagues found that women were not as motivated to achieve as much as men. And in addition, conclusions suggested that women's higher need to be accepted and liked is what disrupted achievement. But Trait theorists tend to overgeneralize and overinterpret data, and so this may or may not be true. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs theory applies to personality, and his theory on personality minimized the importance of masculine and feminine traits. And so he believed that personality differences stem from this need for personal growth. And so our personality is determined by self-actualization and our desire to be all that we can be. So in order to achieve this goal, we have to meet a number of basic needs, and this includes the need for food, safety, love, and self-esteem. And so it really emphasizes the importance of self-actualization and that our instincts play a major role in motivating our behavior. So Maslow believed that the way that individuals seeks fulfillment will determine what their personality qualities are. So for example, when he studied women's low dominance, he believed that feelings of low dominance associated with feelings of inferiority, introversion, and suggestibility. And these characteristics in our culture are often identified as feminine. So they're often misconstrued as being feminine, but in fact, it really is about trying to satisfy a need. Maslow found that women who had strong feelings of self-worth were independent, successful, assertive, and healthy. And so the reasons for this low dominance have a lot to do with cultural influences such as norms, education, status, and expectations. The interactionist approach to personality differences argue that personality is formed from different experiences and situational demands. And so the reason for gender differences come from social roles that need to be occupied. So men and women occupy these different social roles that fulfill social needs. So for example, when women are raised to be nurturing and are placed into social roles that expect nurturing, they tend to act in a more nurturing and caring manner. And so this is why we may see differences in social behaviors between men and women. So for example, with social nonverbal behaviors, women are better at understanding others' nonverbal behaviors and also better at expressing accurate nonverbal messages compared to men. And so the reasons for this is that there are psychological processes that are going on with regard to personality differences and behavior. And these differences do depend on socialization pressures. Studies have shown evidence based on cross-cultural studies of gender differences. They found that there is a strong influence of social expectations and social norms across cultures. So for example, Whiting and Edwards in 1988 studied children from 13 different cultures. And they found that there was consistent gender differences in nurturing behavior. So girls tended to exhibit more nurturing behavior than boys. And then for boys, they tended to have more egoistic dominance, which means trying to control behaviors of others in order to meet your own needs. So they found that boys consistently were more egotistically dominant than girls. And so we now have a better understanding of the cultural and social expectations that might explain some of these gender differences. There are some areas that don't have evidence or don't show evidence for dependable gender differences. This includes dependency, pro-social dominance, and sociability. Culture also provides the context in which our sexual behaviors are learned. And so we have stereotypes in American society where women are interested in love and men are interested in sex. These gender differences in love and sexual behavior can also be classically conditioned. So, for example, double standards have existed in American society, saying that married men can cheat and get away with it, but women who are promiscuous or sleep around are often seen negatively in a very bad light. So, through these processes, boys and men learn to emphasize the physical and superficial aspects of sex, and girls and women learn to focus on relational love aspects of sex. And so, these cognitive and psychological processes, as expectations and fantasies are derived from mass media, intercede in a lot of these sexual responses and behaviors. And so this can play an important role in gender differences in this behavior. So, in summary, gender differences in personality have shown to exist, and generally they're not unchangeable or biologically innate, but they are influenced by a combination of different factors. So, they are influenced by biological tendencies, genetics, motives, and abilities, social expectations and norms, learning and conditioning, and situational demands.